inaccurate. But I wanted to make sure that everyone had a chance to meet John Buehrens. We were so blessed to have had him preach yesterday from our high pulpit. Quite a stirring sermon using the parable of the fig tree. And if it does not bear fruit, chop away at it. And so the question was to us, are we going to bear fruit as a church as we move forward into the future? Or are we going to be a barren tree, basically? And he encouraged us with our living memorial. Not only was he offering to give money, but he encouraged us to seek from our trustees a 7 to 10 times match. So we will, continue to discuss that, of course, but that was very rousing, John, and I'm very grateful to you for talking about that and your pride in doing this.
Thank you. Thank you, Joy. I guess I do have a periodic reputation as a bit of a rabble-rouser. But today, actually, I intend to speak about truth, reconciliation, and repair in relation to the Living Memorial Project at King's Chapel and Visions. And I want to dedicate my remarks to the late Reverend Victor Carpenter and his dear wife, Kathy, who's with us. They were servants of the Unitarian congregation in Cape Town, South Africa in the 1960s under the apartheid regime, and undertook some of the most daring work of ministry that I know about. It concluded with Victor being expelled, the family being expelled from the country. Because among other things, Victor found that it was absolutely necessary to his conscience to support people who were resisting the white supremacy regime and its apartheid policies. Kathy told me just earlier today when we were speaking that they went back in the 1980s when the pressure from the international community was really beginning to gather. And I know of some of the work that they did then, but I also know that by then the congregation in Cape Town had been involved in a number of interesting ways. Victor's successor was a journalist who was probably the most anti-apartheid journalist in all of South Africa. And he attracted to the congregation then a man named Gordon Oliver, who was about to become the mayor of Cape Town. And as deputy mayor, he had been warned that he needed to find a mayor's chaplain. And he turned to Vic's successor, the Unitarian minister, to serve in that role. And when Nelson Mandela, first of all, when Desmond Tutu led an enormous march against white-only voting, Gordon Oliver, as the minister, as the mayor and the member of the Unitarian congregation, took the entire city council of Cape Town, all white, and marched with Tutu to protest all white voting. This was the critical moment when the apartheid regime realized that they had lost the country's second capital, and they had lost the Cape Province. There was no longer going to support the ongoing apartheid regime. It's when the national government in South Africa realized that they needed to that they needed to free Nelson Mandela from Robben Island and negotiate the future of the country. Gordon Oliver, whom I had the privilege of conducting a service with on the Sunday that Victor was being memorialized here as the minister emeritus of the church in Belmont. Gordon welcomed Nelson Mandela to City Hall in Cape Town and conducted Mandela out onto the balcony where he addressed 100,000 people who were gathered to hear from the newly named leader of the country, about the future of the country. And of course, that was the occasion on which Mandela, to his everlasting credit, embraced the notion of a nonviolent truth and reconciliation process to be led by Archbishop Tutu, and said that it was that the real need was for one of spiritual and other repair. That was the vital component in any racial reconciliation that the country of South Africa could go through. I can't tell you how moving I found it to be in the church in Cape Town, remembering Victor and how he had laid the groundwork for this. And Kathy, I know you were fully his partner in every aspect of that work, both then and back in the 80s and during Victor's ministry in San Francisco, where I ended up as one of his successors. So let's talk a little bit more about truth, reconciliation, and repair in relation to the very real history of King's Chapel on matters of race, and why some reconciliation and repair work is not only due, but overdue. I think many members of the Society of King's Chapel know quite well that in the pre-revolutionary era, some of the most prominent members of the congregation, families like the Royals and the Vassals and the Apthorpes, were also deeply enmeshed in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and garnered their fortunes from there and brought their house servants from there, and often had those servants sitting in the gallery of the building that was raised in 1753. The children of the enslaved were sometimes christened there. We have the records of all those whose names have been so poignantly read at Lenten services just this year. I was privileged to read some of their names yesterday. What is not often remembered is just how brutal those sugar plantations were. By one estimate, the lifespan of an enslaved person in Barbados was about 10 years before they had to go back to Africa to find replacements. There's even evidence, frankly, that after the British ban on the slave trade, some of those transportations continued. The Lilly Endowment, in giving King's Chapel this remarkable gift of $2.5 million that will allow for the completion of the physical memorial, also, has encouraged the congregation and funded the process of doing what amounts to a forensic audit of where the funds to build the building and to establish the endowments actually came from. This is the kind of work that's been carried out by some of our leading colleges and universities at Brown and at Harvard and elsewhere. And I think it's certainly important for King's Chapel to find details about where the money came from that built the building that we enjoy, where the money came from that began the endowments that are the oldest and therefore have gained the most over the years. Things like the Price Fund that we share with Trinity Church. I have reason to believe that the Price money has some origins in the Jamaica plantations, where, yeah. But all of that needs to be given a lot more historical research and, as I say, sort of a forensic audit. What isn't widely known is the track record of the members of King's Chapel in the period that I tried to characterize in the book that I wrote called Conflagration: how the Transcendentalists sparked the American struggle for racial, gender, and social justice. The thread figure in my narrative, which encompasses quite a number of important and influential people, some better known than others. The thread figure is a child of King's Chapel, James Freeman Clark, named for his step-grandfather, the first Unitarian minister and rector of King's Chapel, James Freeman. But as near as I can tell, by the 1830s, when the abolitionist movement really begins in Boston, and it's often dated to January the 1st, 1831, when William Lloyd Garrison launches his famous newspaper, The Liberator. Starting in the 1830s, the growing divide between abolitionists and anti-abolitionists sadly had most of the members of King's Chapel clearly on the anti-abolitionist side. I look forward to finding anyone that I can name who was an active member of King's Chapel whose credentials are clearly on the abolitionist side, particularly in the early years. Now, when you come to analyzing the track record of people in relation to abolitionism, mind you, it's very important that you ask the question, when did this person become an abolitionist? In the 1830s, as was probably true starting as early as the War of 1812 and the end of it, people who were involved in that Second American Revolution and the burgeoning of American commerce that followed it often thought that, rightly or wrongly, that the abolitionist movement that was going on in Britain at the time, which resulted in the British abolition of slavery in their Caribbean colonies as of 1833, that abolitionist movement was actually aiming at dividing North from South here in America, getting hold of Southern cotton for British purposes, and cutting off the Northern textile mills from the supply of Southern cotton. And it was just troublemaking and British troublemaking at that. So there was a certain amount of political concern about the abolitionist movement in its early phases that was very much tied up with the development of the Northern textile industry. The mills in Waltham and Lowell and others. By the way, prominent members of King's Chapel were heavily involved in the Boston Associates, who established those mills. Now, I don't see members of King's Chapel necessarily being a part of the more brutal side of the anti-abolitionist movement, but we shouldn't be shocked to discover that there were, in fact, Boston area bankers, merchants, and prominent people who deliberately stirred up mob violence against abolitionists. Mayor Theodore Lyman, who served the city from 1834 to 1836, and who I don't believe was a member of the chapel, is sort of typical of one of the things that went on in the city. He, in his first year in office, presided over a very large public meeting at Faneuil Hall, in which the abolitionists were condemned by resolution, and the entire business community of Boston put itself firmly on record as opposed to the abolition of slavery. Whoa. Even prominent members of King's Chapel that I think a lot of, like Oliver Wendell Holmes, the dean of Harvard Medical School, the autocrat of the breakfast table, the poet of Thanatopsis and other lovely poems, during this period had to be counted among the anti-abolitionists. In 1835, not just months after Lyman's public meeting, a British abolitionist speaking to the Anti-Slavery Society that William Lloyd Garrison headed was threatened in his life and decided not to actually make the speech. Garrison gave it for him and was promptly assaulted by a large, mostly working class white crowd, but clearly put up to this by Boston business leaders. They threatened to hang William Lloyd Garrison for his abolitionist views, and it ran him to the Common, where they intended to tar and feather him. It was Mayor Lyman who had to step in with the police to rescue Garrison from being killed. And by the way, this was not unique to Boston. There were anti-abolitionist riots in the same era in New York, in Philadelphia, and in a number of other places. Now, the Annals of King's Chapel make it clear that during this period, the Anti-Slavery Society, in holding one of its large annual gatherings in Boston, actually petitioned for the use of the chapel for one of its sub-meetings. When these large societies, and the anti-slavery movement was really growing, they spread out to the big churches in town. The trustees of King's Chapel, or was it the vestry at that point? Yes, it was the vestry. Wrote back very politely saying, no, we don't allow the chapel to be used for anything other than public worship. Now, I have to point out that this was going on also at other churches in town. The Federal Street Church, where William Ellery Channing, the very prominent Unitarian minister, was serving, was a good example. The trustees elected by the pew owners of that church actually told Dr. Channing that he was forbidden to announce from the pulpit meetings of the Anti-Slavery Society. So much for freedom of the pulpit. The worst of these offenses against Channing's conscience, by the way, in 1835, Channing wrote a book called Slavery, which was highly influential. He did not identify himself as an abolitionist, but the book, in effect, calls for the ending of slavery. He felt that Garrison took the wrong grounds for asking for the end of slavery. Among other things, Garrison's approach was entirely grounded in moral suasion against the churches. In fact, he called for people of conscience to leave the churches because the churches were upholding the status quo and slavery. There's another question about whether moral suasion was ever going to carry the day. We'll get to that when I talk about Frederick Douglass and his relationship with Ephraim Peabody as a minister of King's Chapel. Well, in 1840, the event that gives my book its title, the conflagration of the steamer Lexington on Long Island Sound, took the life of Unitarian minister Charles Follen, who was an almost forgotten key figure in the founding of the Transcendentalist movement. He'd been a student of Immanuel Kant in Germany and brought the notion of a categorical moral imperative to the Transcendentalist students at Harvard Divinity School when he taught there. And he was ordained at Federal Street Church as Channing's representative to the anti-slavery movement. But when he died in that tragic steamship fire, the steamer having been loaded to the gills with bales of burnable cotton, some of them up against the hot smokestack of the steamer, all but 4 people aboard, 138 people were killed in January the 10th, 1840. And the Anti-Slavery Society wanted to hold a memorial service for Reverend Follen at the Federal Street Church where he had been ordained. The representatives of the pew holders, the trustees at Federal Street, forbade Channing having such a memorial service. Channing's reaction was to preach one last sermon for those people, a sermon in memory of his protege Follen, and then to tell the trustees that he would take no more of their money, and that if they wished him to resign as the pastor who still cared about their souls, they could ask for it. But he stepped away from receiving any further money and let them turn the responsibilities of the pulpit and his public ministry over to his associate, Gannett. The last 2 years of Channing's life were devoted to defending the abolition of slavery, the emancipation of everyone, and freedom of the pulpit. This is directly relevant to some of the issues that surround King's Chapel during the same era. In the winter of 1840, James Freeman Clark, as I say, a child of King's Chapel, returned to Boston. On the frontier, he had seen the various branches of Christianity competing with one another and had long been asking himself, how should a Christian church properly be organized? One of the things that he had concluded was that the system of pew ownership was completely incompatible with the proper relation of Christian believers to one another and to their God. True discipleship, he felt, was a discipleship of equals, in which we should instruct one another and not be totally dependent upon the clerics, but to understand ourselves as equal disciples of Jesus Christ. He gave lectures on the ideal of a Christian church at the Swedenborgian Chapel, which was just a block away from King's Chapel. I guess he knew that the trustees wouldn't rent to him at the church where he had been raised. He articulated 3 basic principles that he thought every Christian church should be organized on. One was a tribute to King's Chapel. Unlike the other Puritan churches in the city, he believed in what he called the liturgical principle, understanding liturgy in the root sense of the term. In Greek, you know, you can trace it back to the words meaning work and people. Liturgy, common worship, is the work of the people. All too often, congregational churches in that era, Puritan and Unitarian alike, Orthodox and Unitarian alike, were so focused on the pulpit that you actually read things like, Dr. Channing went to the desk and read the hymn. The lack of participation by the congregation was striking. Clark wanted a congregation that worships as we do today at King's Chapel, with responsive elements of the liturgy, and with lay people not only coming forward to read scripture, but often leading in prayers. And he insisted lay people should preach. Moreover, he even felt that lay people under the right circumstances could easily offer the dominical sacraments of both baptism and presiding at the Eucharist. When he became ill, it was lawyers in his congregation, like John Albion Andrew, who becomes governor of Massachusetts during the Civil War, and Ellis Gray Loring, who was one of the leading figures in the abolitionist movement, who actually conducted communion services for the rest of the disciples. The Church of the Disciples was not only formed by a child of King's Chapel as another prayer book liturgical Unitarian congregation within sight of King's Chapel, it also pursued two paths that King's Chapel clearly did not. One was the voluntary principle. As I say, Clark had determined that the system of pew ownership was incompatible with Christian equality because it only empowered those who had the resources to buy and rent a pew to elect the trustees, who then controlled the building. His voluntary principle meant that what now obtains in almost every congregation I know, the idea that everyone who has signed the covenant of the church, become a covenanted member of the congregation and contributes to its upkeep and its operations to whatever extent they are able, is a full voting member of the congregation. The other principle that he insisted upon was one that he actually kind of borrowed from the Methodists. He'd seen the good work done in Methodist congregations through what he called the social principle. That is, coming together at times across class lines to pray together, to discern together what kind of mission fell upon the congregation that they should try to implement as best they could. So the three principles, liturgical, voluntary, and social, caused the creation of the Church of the Disciples, which had its first building on Beacon Hill on a little cul-de-sac that no longer exists called Freeman Place, and a building that was built in 1847. As I say, just a block from King's Chapel. It's something of a rebuke to what was going on at King's Chapel during that time. By the way, as near as I can tell, many of the people who were actually concerned about the abolition of slavery by that point had quit King's Chapel. Charles Sumner, although he was raised in the family pew at King's Chapel, when he is buried from King's Chapel, Henry Wilder Foote says that we can't really claim him as a congregant. He was very close to James Freeman Clarke, who called on him. I've got that scene in my book. Called on him after Sumner was beaten on the floor of the U.S. Senate for his abolitionist views. The truth of the matter is that in 1847, for example, when the disciples raised their building, the minister of King's Chapel, Ephraim Peabody, was a longtime colleague and close friend of James Freeman Clarke's. And yet Clarke knew that Peabody was not lifting his voice at all against slavery. And neither were any active members of the congregation, the most prominent of whom was the senior warden during much of Ephraim Peabody's 10-year stint as the minister of King's Chapel, namely Samuel Atkins Elliott I, who was at different times mayor of Boston, a state senator, a state representative, and for one term, the U.S. congressman representing the city of Boston, 1850 to 1851. Samuel Atkins Elliott is typical, I believe, of most of the views of lay people in the congregation in the abolitionist era. On the one hand, he had a certain sympathy for the enslaved. It's probably best demonstrated by the book that he published in 1849, which was a narrative of the formerly enslaved person known as Josiah Henson. Samuel Atkins Eliot seems to have actually interviewed Josiah Henson, who was an extremely articulate public speaker, even though he was illiterate. Henson had escaped slavery in Kentucky by earning enough to pay his master to leave, and had gone to Canada. The central part of the narrative of Henson's life really focuses on his Christian conversion, in which he was impressed by the fact that the scriptures testify to the fact that Christ died for everyone, male and female, Jew and Greek, slave and free. And in his Christian conversion, Josiah Henson decided that he had to show patience as an enslaved person and obey his master until he could earn his freedom. This narrative of Josiah Henson by Samuel Atkins Eliot provides the model for Uncle Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Harriet Beecher Stowe acknowledged as much. So as I say, Samuel Atkins Eliot had a certain sympathy for the enslaved. But like most white people in that time, he was desperately concerned about anyone who would claim their freedom rather than buy it or have it bought for them. Today, I was trying to get at the Boston Public Library a good look at a book that I have never really fully inspected, although Joy tells me I can find it online. And that is a book attributed to Samuel Atkins Eliot, I think with pretty sound reason, called Slavery and Its Prospects in America. This dates to 1857. And it is clearly an apology for slavery, and something of a kind of an attempt at a dispassionate economic analysis. It does no credit to Eliot, and it certainly does not make him at all sympathetic to the abolitionist movement. And it's particularly ironic that it's published the year right before the US Supreme Court makes the absolutely most horrific decision in its entire history in the Dred Scott case, which declares that people of African origin can never be citizens and never be recognized in the courts of the United States, the way Dred Scott was in his trying to claim his freedom for being moved north. I mean, in effect, if the Dred Scott decision had stood, slavery would have been made legal everywhere in the United States, not just in the southern states. It made the Civil War absolutely inevitable, in my view, as a historian. It's the same year, 1 year after the death of Ephraim Peabody, that Samuel Atkins Eliot published a collection of Peabody's sermons with a memoir of the man's life. I was able to obtain a copy of this rather rare book because a dear lady offered it to the Unitarian Universalist Historical Society, with which I'm affiliated. And I said I would be glad to receive it myself and make sure that it received the proper disposition when I was done inspecting it. The memoir by Atkins Eliot of Peabody has some terms like this. This is him speaking of his minister. The topics of his discourses were various enough to excite a constant interest in his hearers without going into those subjects of temporary excitement, politics, or controversy of any sort, which did not seem to him profitable or suitable to that time or place. I would just suggest that in addition to Peabody having his own reasons probably for keeping silent on the subject of abolition and the injustices of slavery, there was almost certainly some pressure from the lay people in the congregation that he should not touch upon such things at all. As I say, I remain open to discovering any active abolitionist in the congregation of King's Chapel in the 1840s and 50s. And it is in that period that even some of the most conservative business people in the city begin to see the injustice of slavery and the need to come down firmly on the anti-slavery side. One break is clearly with the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, for which Samuel Atkins Eliot voted aye, even while Horace Mann, another representative of Massachusetts in the same House, in the same session, voted nay. That act caused citizens of Massachusetts to be forced to find and return fugitives from slavery or themselves face punishment. Every federal district court in the United States was ordered to have a slave catcher marshal who would be paid $10 if the fugitive was sent back to slavery, but only $5 if the person was found to have been free after all. One of the most horrendous acts that the US Congress ever passed, although I think maybe the current Congress may get close. The rendition of Anthony Buehrens in 1854, a fugitive from Virginia who was caught and then marched through the streets of Boston under military guard to a military ship that would carry him back to slavery, radicalized everybody. I mean, Amos Abbott Lawrence, one of the mill owners, wrote in his own journal, "We all went to bed good old-fashioned Boston cotton wigs." That is, tied to the textile industry and reluctant to be involved in anti-slavery because of that. We went to bed cotton wigs and we woke up stark raving abolitionists in 1854. Even then, I can't find any abolitionists in the King's Chapel membership. And it's sort of testified to by Samuel Atkins Eliot's book in 1857 and his memoir of Ephraim Peabody. Now, this is particularly ironic for Peabody. Peabody had been Clark's colleague in starting the Western Messenger out in the Ohio Valley when Ephraim Peabody began his ministry as the minister of the First Unitarian Church in Cincinnati, and Clark was in Louisville. Cincinnati was the place that slaves ran to from Kentucky. But while he was there, Ephraim Peabody had actually witnessed white mobs burn down the Black community twice in race riots that were anti-abolitionist and anti-Black. I think this kind of, and Peabody was ill his entire professional life. He died at the age of only 49. He had tuberculosis from the time that he started preaching. He left Cincinnati and became minister in New Bedford for almost a decade before he came to King's Chapel. And the New Bedford Unitarian Church was actually one of the more radical congregations, a lot of ex-Quakers in it. It was a congregation that tried to get Ralph Waldo Emerson to be their minister, but Waldo was not going back into the ministry. Uh, during the 10 years that Peabody was there, quite ill, sharing the ministry, so he was half-time, sharing the ministry with a colleague. His family had the distinction of being the first to hire a newly freed man named Frederick Douglass. And Douglas Blight, the Yale historian, who's the biographer of Frederick Douglass, has this wonderful scene of one of Peabody's daughters watching Frederick Douglass taking a break from carrying coal for the family by sitting on the kitchen table. Mind you, he's newly freed from slavery, and he's studying French. As I say, the evidence is that Frederick Douglass earned his first dollars as a free man from the Peabody family during the New Bedford years. But here, when Peabody comes to King's Chapel, full-time now, and serves for 10 years, not a peep on the subject of slavery from the minister, nor, as near as I can tell, from any prominent layperson in the congregation, although I'm prepared to be corrected because you can't prove a negative. You can, one has to search around pretty thoroughly, however, to see the evidence of any active anti-slavery thing. Now, how does this tie in with the living memorial? Yesterday in my sermon, I mentioned a recent book by that's entitled "The Plunder of Black America: How the Racial Wealth Gap Was Made." It's by Calvin Schermerhorn, who is professor of history at Arizona State. He's got an earlier book about the growth of American capitalism on the backs of enslaved people. But in this book, what he does is very poignant family histories in different regions and different eras of American history, showing how the culture of white supremacy over and over created structures that prevented the accumulation of significant wealth to pass from one generation to another in Black families. Whether it was the fairly recent mortgage collapse in 2008, when a disproportionate number of the subprime mortgages that went belly up were actively marketed to and deliberately marketed to African-American families, or the exclusion of African-American veterans from many of the benefits of the GI Bill, or the elimination of farm workers and domestic workers from Social Security when it was first set up, or the collapse of the Freedmen's Bank in the 1870s, when Frederick Douglass was set up as the front man for a bank that was really run by people who were speculating in railroad bonds and corrupt as can be, the Jay Cook people. Over and over again, you have a kind of plundering, that's Douglass's term, by the way, of the accumulated labor value of people of color in our society that has left this legacy of a situation in which I believe to this day, the average Black family has got something like 1/9 of the accumulated wealth of the average white family. And we wonder why there are more social problems in communities of color. Without the wherewithal to promote one's children's education, without the wherewithal to own a home of your own, without the wherewithal to establish a viable business. How do Black communities prosper? This is the issue of reconciliation and repair that is before not just the Society of King's Chapel, God knows, but before all of white America. It's why there's been a reopened discussion of that almost forbidden word, reparations. Out in California, we've actually had a state commission on the subject, and I've participated in some of the hearings that have reported out how difficult that's going to be. It's just almost impossible to do more than relational repair at this point. The economic repair, I think, is almost incalculable. But it is relational repair that actually belongs to the religious life. What are we called to do? But to confess brokenness and to try to repair relationships. Over and over as a pastor, I've met with people who have entered recovery programs like Alcoholics Anonymous and have discovered that their amends to the people that they have wronged are now in a position where those people are dead. What do? AA calls it living amends. I believe that the Living Memorial Project that the Society of King's Chapel has undertaken is a form of relational repair and living amends. The goal, I hope, is to find some partnerships in the Black community that will be really meaningful over a long period of time, that will be transformative in two directions, because a meaningful partnership should transform both parties. That includes those of us who enjoy white privilege and those of us who may provide what I hope will be an endowment to fund such partnerships. Now, I was bold enough to say from the pulpit yesterday that I believe that our trustees, who are the good stewards of the investments that make the maintenance of our building and the ongoing operations of our society possible. They are now the stewards of, I understand, more than $40 million in endowments. There needs to be an audit about where some of those original funds came from, but as I understand the responsibility of trustees, and I was a fiduciary for 1,700 different trusts when I was the president of the UUA. The trustees have some discretion over the accumulated increase. There is no reason why some portion of the increase in those endowments can't be set aside for relational repair with the descendants of those who were enslaved by members of our congregation and who built their fortunes in such a way as to exploit the labor of enslaved people and make possible both the building of our building and the building of our endowments. I propose that we try to raise even more money as a living congregation than we did for the physical memorial. The physical memorial was, like any aesthetic project, subject to a lot of different opinions. It still is. And that's understandable. I've been a minister of enough churches that I know that the passions grow most acute when the debate is over something like what color should the ladies' restroom be painted. Anything aesthetic gets people all exercised. But we've actually managed to overcome that. Okay, it was 2-1. A good 30% of the congregation was not terribly convinced that this was the right form of physical memorial, but it's going in, thank God. I served a congregation out in Needham, Massachusetts that had a knockdown, drag-out fight about what color the new parish hall should be painted, because should it be colonial white like the meeting house, or as the architect and the building committee proposed, a colonial color but not white, so that it would not detract from the centrality of the meeting house. 63 to 62. What pleased me was not a single one of the people who lost the vote. It's not white, by the way. Not one of those 62 people left the congregation or took their money. I would hope that at King's Chapel, we also defer to the democratic principle. And I would suggest that as a voting congregation, we ask the vestry and wardens to petition the trustees to match our generosity for the living memorial, not 1-to-1, not 3-to-1, not 5-to-1, but 10-to-1. Okay, I'd settle for a biblical 7 times. But we need to raise, I hope, $250,000 out of our own pockets. That'll be a deep stretch, but I'm going to go and give as deeply as I can, probably twice what I gave to the physical memorial, because I believe that this is our call to Christian witness. To Christian witness, not only, which I regard as deeply important to the Unitarian Universalist Association. I once heard Carl Scoville preach a sermon on the text, "I am the root and ye are the branches," when there were 19 Unitarian Universalist ministers visiting in the congregation. King's Chapel doesn't recognize it, but it has a historic and a present influence far beyond its relatively small numbers, both within our association and because of its position in downtown Boston on the Freedom Trail. It has an influence on the entire city and on the entire nation as it comes to celebrate, and this is the 250th anniversary, the freedom represented by the American Revolution, in which colonists rose up against the mother country to claim their freedom. Now, you and I know that after the revolution, not everyone was free. Not everyone could vote. Ours is a long history of a struggle toward a more perfect union, as the Constitution itself puts it. But our witness as a congregation, both religiously and civically, should be firmly on the side of truth, reconciliation, and what relational repair we can bear honest witness to. I don't think we can bear honest witness to our friends in the African American community without funding projects that help to correct at least some measure of the historic wrongs. And so that's my historically based challenge to us as a congregation. It's one I feel very deeply about. But as I said yesterday, I have been so proud of being a member of the Society of King's Chapel that on a number of occasions when my dear wife said, "Oh, shut up," I have actually bragged about us and about the memorial project, describing the physical memorial, and now our efforts to have a truly meaningful living memorial. And with that, I think I should probably shut up, as my dear wife said, and let you offer whatever queries or comments you may wish about these remarks on the Living Memorial Project, Truth, Reconciliation, and Repair. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, John. 2 days in a row. Thank you for your message. Really appreciate it. It's 6 o'clock or 5:59. But John, if you're willing to entertain a few questions, maybe
I am.
15 minutes,
Sure.
those of you who are able to stay, let's do that. But, you know, we are mindful of the time also. Thoughts?
Stephen, is it the case that you are, as junior warden, going to have something to do with this living memorial project?
Definitely have something to do with it.
Okay. I would be glad to participate in whatever discussions there are about the fundraising strategy. Having begged for a living as the president of the denomination, I know something about how these appeals need to be made. And by the way, I would encourage the vestry to make the appeal to the trustees early, so that whatever match they may be willing to offer can be part of the appeal.
Thank you very much for your offer there, John, and you will be taken up on that offer.
Dean, you've unmuted. Did you have something to say?
I just wanted to thank you for your words and for your message. And as someone who has been on this journey for a long time and kind of struggling going up and down, and just being with people who are supportive and being with people who are not as supportive. It's so nice to hear the things that you've had to say, the message that you give. And you know, every once in a while, it's like for me, you're an oasis as I go through this desert. And I took a drink yesterday, and I had another one tonight. So thank you very much for your words.
Maybe that had something to do with the Old Testament text, which was from Isaiah 55, where we are said to, come and drink at a living fountain, and where we are to eat that which is nourishing in the long run. The call is a prophetic call that's on us. And I think the witness that we have at King's Chapel, grounded in Scripture, grounded in Christian worship, is so important. We're in another time when our very democracy is threatened, frankly. And as James Luther Adams, one of our leading Unitarian Christian theologians of the 20th century, saw when he went to Germany in the 1930s, it was only those who were grounded in the prophetic, who knew how to bear witness against those who would take away the worth and dignity of ordinary citizens. And this could not be a more important time for us to bear witness to that. And to do it on the Freedom Trail. I remember vividly Faith Scoville piping up during the discussions with the mass design folks saying, some of this has got to be outside. It's got to be where people can see it. Amen.
Amen.
And I want to be back here in August. I'm going to be taking my grandson on a trip to Europe in late August. But I'm going to stop here in Boston again, and I want to take him to see the physical memorial. And by then, I also want to, I hope, hear what more I can do to encourage the funding of a meaningful living memorial. I think we need more than $2 million in the fund. That will throw off, $100,000 a year that could be devoted to some very meaningful projects. It doesn't have to be huge, but it has to engage the members of the congregation, both present and to come. And I believe the key to building the membership of the congregation in a time when people are abandoning churches right and left is to do something meaningful on one of the critical issues of our time, which is the now again growing gap between wealth and poverty, between a white supremacy movement, which is what we are faced with, and those of us who would bear witness for Thomas Starr King out in San Francisco in 1860 said, where the races are most diverse, God has appointed his most important work to be done.
Hmm.
Said that on Emancipation Day, 1860, in a speech to the entire Black community in San Francisco. People of color wept. We can do something that is really God's work. And I would be untrue to my ordination vows if I didn't summon us to it. And I'm so glad to have Joy Fallon as one of my pastors, because I admire the way in which she has, in such a patient and balanced way, guided everyone in this congregation through a difficult process of coming to terms with a difficult history. God bless you, Joy. I know how hard it is to pastor in times of polarized opinion. And you've done it with patience and grace and dignity and persistence.
And love.
And love. Yes, exactly. And that's the key to all of this. All right, pipe up somebody and then we'll drop the subject. Anybody?
John, how much of what you shared with us tonight is in Conflagration?
Well, not all of it. That book was published in 2020. Sadly, it came out just as the whole country went into the COVID lockdown. So the book never got quite the attention I had hoped. I had 5 author tours that were canceled.
Oh. Would you come to our author tour? We could set up an author tour for you. I mean, I just want to read. I want to read and understand. It's lovely to hear it from you. I tried to take notes while you were talking, but
yeah,
it's more than my mind can comprehend. I need to really sit with it.
Well, there's more to be done. Some of it will come from this sort of historical audit that the Lilly Endowment has charged us with doing in order to earn their grant. Some of it can come from my book, but I've been doing research beyond the book. I've recently decided that my next projects are probably going to be shorter biographical things. There is a biography of Ephraim Peabody on the Dictionary of Unitarian Universalist Biography, of which I'm the assistant editor. I'm afraid I'm going to correct it. It doesn't really take into account his book on slavery. It doesn't take into account his vote against his vote for the fugitive slave law. So some of these things have been glossed over. The culture of white supremacy does not like to look at the sins perpetrated in its name. And that one of the deepest spiritual challenges of our time is to be honest and clear-eyed, practice truth. Truth is absolutely necessary before there can be any meaningful reconciliation. And that reconciliation can only be brought about by acts of spiritual and material repair. And with that, I think I'll say goodnight to all of you.
Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you. We
Thank
send
you so much.
We send you on our way with prayers and with love. And we can have this talk transcribed, and printed, so we could do that. We'll run it by John, but that's possible. There's a lot of what he said in Conflagration, but as he said, he's added more tonight, and he was not quite as tough on King's Chapel in his book as he is.
Well,
now.
that was not my point.
No.
I certainly celebrated Clark. By the way, his mother quit King's Chapel over this issue. We shouldn't neglect that. There are other people who left King's Chapel for the disciples or for other congregations because of its silence on the issue of abolition and anti-slavery. All right. Good night.
Thank you all.
Right, thank you, John.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
John.
No,